We're going to cover the subject of Bishul Akum, foods that are cooked by an Akum, by a non-Jew. And as we said in the last chapter, in the chapter of Pas Akum, and we gave an introduction to these set of rabbinic laws, that the primary reason why the Chachamim established these laws is to prevent chasnas, to prevent intermarriage. And we said the details of what's prohibited regarding pas and what's prohibited regarding bishul are different from one another. Okay, let's look at inside Perek Revi, Hilchos Bishul Akum Aleph. Kederech she'osru Chachamim pas akum, just like the Chachamim asr pas akum, kein osru gam Bishul Akum. They also said Bishul Akum is osru lachein kol tafshil shebishul hanochri, any tafshil, any food that a nochri cooked, also Sheikh Lemni Yisrael, a Yid would not be allowed to eat it. Kvar Nispor Lamala, we explained earlier, Shachmiru B'Yisr Zeh B'Yisr Akum, Chachamim were machmir. By this Bishul Akum, Yoyisum Mimah Shachmiru B'Yisr Akum, more than what they were with regarding Pas Akum Ki Gzeir, as Bishul Akum, this Gzeir Bishul Akum, this Kabla B'Chol Yisrael, was accepted by all Yidden. V'gan Ein B'Tafshel Chaya Nefesh. A food does not have the component of chaya nefesh. Chaya nefesh refers to it's my basic sustenance, which is the basis for reasoning in halacha why pas palta would be permissible. But by bishul, by other foods, it's not basic sustenance. A person could theoretically live off just bread and water and very basic sustenance. So the cooked foods they can do without in a very, very bare bone sense. Even a nochri who's a palter, even a nochri who's a palter. Let's say they're cooking foods for the sake of sale. It's a business, so you can say, well, it's not such a concern that it's going to develop into a personal relationship where your child's going to marry their child that lead to intermarriage. Still, by Bishul Akum, the Chacham were more strict. And it's still usher, even if it was made by a palter, even if it was made by a manufacturer. So the structure of Bishul Akum is stricter than pas in this regard. That any food that's subject to the laws of Bishul Akum would be usher, even if it's made by a palter, even if it's made by a manufacturer. Because the only reason why the rabbis were more lenient by bread is because ala pas yechia ha'adam, because bread is the basic sustenance. And last class, which was yesterday, we also learned that according to the spiritual side of things, the Kabbalah, ala pas yechia adam is a reason to be stringent. That same reasoning can go both ways. The Isser of Bishul Akum is also a prohibition against hischatnus, which would be intermarriage. Because again, the power of food is very strong. Maybe you're going to come to share tea together. That's how most poskim explain it. That's how the Rambam and Rashi brings it down in the Gemara and Avodah Zarah. There's a secondary reason. The Aruch HaShulchan brings down that by Bishul Akum, there's an additional chashash. Maybe the non-Jew is going to put something that's not kosher in the mix because they wouldn't know or whatever. They don't keep kosher. They're not subject to these laws. They don't know. So that's a secondary concern as to why you cannot allow Bishul Akum. A Jew has to be involved in the cooking process. Now, in order to qualify as being the type of food that requires a Jew's involvement, two things have to be in place. Number one has to be the kind of food that's not edible in the raw state. So, for example, an apple or carrots, you can eat them raw. So, according to the strict letter of the law, if a non-Jew cooks apples and carrots, it's not Bishul Akum because it's edible raw. And the Chai Adam gives a very, I would call it even fascinating, a very, very straightforward explanation. He says there isn't this feeling of indebtedness that's engendered by cooking the apple or the carrots. It'd be like, wow, you took something that was inedible and then you made it edible. No. You can eat it raw. You can eat it cooked. It's like a choice. I can have it raw. I can have my apples this way. I can have applesauce. I can chew my carrot like a bunny rabbit, or I can have tzimmis. It's a choice. Meaning to say that it's not like the other way is not edible. But on the other hand, when you take something that's inedible in a raw state. For example, a piece of meat or a potato, and then someone cooks it. There's this feeling of this wow effect, like wow, you took something that's not you really made it into a succulent dish. So there's a much greater opportunity and a chance for a feeling of indebtedness, which could lead to a closeness, etc., which could lead to intermarriage, which is a disservice to both nations. Once again, I just want to bring out a point here. So we see that there is a difference between foods that are edible raw and foods that are not edible raw. When a food is not edible raw, there is a heightened concern of a person feeling this strong sense of indebtedness, which could lead to problems. Okay, that's the concern. The other point I want to mention is that we're going to get to in a moment, and I'll take your question, is that it also has to be the kind of food that would be oila al shulchan melachim, the kind of food that would be served at a fancy event. Shulchan melachim v'sorim lavdavka means a type of an event that would be a nicer type of a meal. So for example, a wedding or a dinner and the like. Because once the food is of that stature, again, there's that feeling of indebtedness and of closeness. On the other hand, when it comes to, let's say, a snack food, which doesn't have that kind of stature, for example, let's say popcorn, that wouldn't be a problem. Yes, your question.
So raw food is something that you just wouldn't eat raw, like, because you could eat pasta, but you just wouldn't do that.
That's not called raw food.
Pasta isn't raw?
No, well, pasta is raw food, but it's not edible raw.
Right.
We're talking about foods that are edible raw. Foods that it's the norm to eat in a raw state. So apples, carrots, oranges, whatever. There's a lot of other examples, like bananas, right? All those foods. So let's use apples and carrots as examples because those are often also cooked. You couldn't cook apples and make applesauce. You can cook carrots and make tzimmis. But again, they're both edible in the raw state. So there would not be a problem of Bishul Akum if a non-Jew cooked them.
So just things that you don't typically eat raw.
Correct. Things that you don't eat raw, and both things have to be in place. You don't eat raw and are also the type of food that would be of a royal nature. Those are a problem with Bishul Akum. So let me finish. Eis Gimel is going to explain it, the whole thing in depth. Shnei Tanoim Misnu Chazal B'Yisur Bishul Akum. There are two Tanoim that the Chazal established regarding Bishul Akum. Ha'echad sheyeh ha'maichal dover ha'tzorach bishul should be the kind of food that requires cooking. It's not fitting to even eat it raw. If it's something that you could eat raw, ain't shum chashiva, so there's no chashiva shebishlei hanochi that the non-Jew cooked it. The nechshav kilu le'yosam nochli kum. It's as if the non-Jew didn't do anything. Hatnai hasheni, the second tnai is sheyehei ha'maichal dover ha'il al shulchan melachim, the kind of food that would be served at a king's table. Hainu sodim anoshim chashuvim doesn't only mean a king's table, but it means at a fancy event. Why? Now comes the reasoning. A food that's not so kosher. Now we're bringing down the Rambam. It's not the norm for a person to invite their friend over to eat. I'm going to give you an example in a moment, but let's just let the point sink in. A food that's not kosher, for example, let's say it's popcorn, or let's say it's cornflakes. You're not going to call up your friend and say, "Hey, you want to come over and have some cornflakes?" She'll say, "Nah, I have in my own apartment. Don't bother me. It's 20 degrees outside." Right? But if you're already in the house, you might have some, but you're not going to schlep out of the house. But if he says to you, "Hey, I just made this succulent supper. I made salmon souffle and I have roasted vegetables," he'll tell me, "Thank you very much. What time is dinner? I'm coming." Because the chashivas of the food is goydem. It's the draw. But if the food is not kosher, I'll have it in my own house. Don't bother me. Right? So I once had a discussion with a famous rabbi. I was traveling with a very, very kosher, prominent rav. We were doing a production overnight. So I had the opportunity to spend 8 hours with a tremendous halachic authority. So we were spending time discussing in Yanim and halacha, and we discussed this question. I said, when you go to a hotel, and in the morning they serve you breakfast, and you see this, they'll serve all kinds of breakfast cereals, right? And they'll serve it as a meal. So can that be used as an argument to say, well, that's a proof that the breakfast cereals, the dried cereals, such as the cornflakes, the Rice Krispies, or whatever, are kosher and they would be served at the king's table? The answer is no. No one's coming to the hotel to have the cornflakes and the Rice Krispies. The hotel is just offering it to you because they want to attract people to come to stay overnight, and that's not going to give it to you in the morning because you're already there. But no one's going to travel there just for that. So therefore, it's not a kosher food for itself. Okay. It's according to the second reason, since it's not something that you would invite your friend over, therefore we're not concerned about them putting in the davar asa. The Chazal, the rabbis only prohibited Bishul Akum only the food that's not edible raw. Also the kind of food that would be served at a king's table. Those two components have to be in place in order for it to qualify as a food that could be Bishul Akum. So, in exclusion of foods that are edible raw, such as apples and carrots, or foods that are just snack foods, such as popcorn. You don't serve popcorn by a fancy dinner. I used to have one of my customers, he already retired. He was a chef for state dinners. He used to cook food for like 5,500 people for like state dinners and big events. So he was my go-to person. I would ask him if they would serve certain types of foods because it's a good barometer whether or not, because the chashivas of the food is very much dependent on the country. Some countries certain foods are chashiv or not, and it goes according to the country that you're living in or where it's manufactured, and the like, or where it's manufactured, it's going to be sold. That's a little bit more of a discussion. But so I used to consult with him and ask him about them. Generally speaking, they don't serve canned foods at fancy events. But canned food is another issue because let's say, for example, the food is the kind of food that's kosher, but only once it's in the can, it's already you wouldn't serve it, right? But if it's the kind of food that wouldn't be edible raw, and it's in the can, a lot of people hold it has to be Bishul Yisrael because it's being cooked. It's chashiv now. It becomes not chashiv later, but it already was chashiv, so it doesn't lose that status. Okay, yeah.
Except that it depends on the country to country, right?
It does depend. Yes.
Does it matter if you travel that place? Like, for example, if you travel to the country, you survive by what's there.
You would have to abide by what's there. Yes. So, for example, in Mexico, from what I understand, tortillas are kosher. Corn tortillas. It's very much a Mexican type of food. It's part of the culture. In America, you can argue that corn tortillas are not kosher. They're more of a fast food type of thing. I'm not saying some might be machmer, but you can argue. And for example, another example would be in Eretz Yisrael. I'm told I haven't seen this myself, but that corn is served at a chatzon. In America, it's not so common to serve corn. You might find a corn salad, but corn is the cheapest feedstock in America, and that's so. It's not as kosher in America as some other countries. Whether or not it has to be Bishul Yisrael, hey, you're going to get a little bit of a different opinions, but there is a little bit of what to talk about there. Now, what about another funny example would be, what about an opera singer? They swallow raw eggs, right? They eat raw eggs. That's what I heard. I never tried it. I'm not an opera singer, but I heard that at least. But that doesn't matter because that doesn't mean that eggs are edible raw. Because we go after the majority of the populace in this country. Majority of the people here would not eat eggs raw. And therefore, eggs have to be made Bishul Yisrael. Something that's edible raw, that the rabbis committed. Even though the non-Jew cooked it, it's dependent on the custom of the people eating it. Most people only eat it cooked. Even though individuals eat it raw, their opinion or their das is nullified to the majority. And the food is also for them also if the non-Jew cooked it. So too would be in the reverse. When most people eat it raw, and the yachid only eats it cooked. The das is the food is cooked, permissible for them. Let's get to our discussion now. When in one country the food is edible raw, in a different country they don't eat it raw. You go after the country with which you're situated in now. I'll tell you a story about this. I like stories. I had a colleague. His name was Rabbi Feivel Muller, a blessed memory. He was an older person. He worked for the OK for a few years. And he told me when he was a child, he told me this about probably 20 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, when he was a child. So we're talking about 80 years past, 80 years ago, probably maybe even more. He said in Europe, nobody ate carrots raw. That's what he told me. I don't know. I wasn't around that. I wasn't born then. But he said nobody ate carrots raw. But in America, you eat carrots raw. So back then, where he lived, yes, carrots would have to be made bishul yisrael because people did not eat them raw. But in America, it is normal to eat them raw. Yes, I think it's pretty, maybe even encouraged. It's healthy, whatever. So it's not something that has to be made bishul yisrael. Now, how do you define something that's going to be served at a king's table? It's also very fascinating. Davar ha'ila, now up to halacha hey. Davar ha'ila shulchan melachim toli gam kein bizman of something that's going to be served at the king's table is also dependent on the place and the time. It's difficult to extrapolate from the poskim of previous generation what's going to be considered today based on what was back then, because things do change, culture and what's considered the norm. So here we see a fascinating illustration of what's today's culture in terms of culinary culture will define what I would say about a particular matter. Does it have to be a shulchan? Is it a shulchan or not? Does it have to be bishul yisrael or not? Based on culinary culture, it's really the idea of dir b'tachtonim, where we're taking what's really happening in Olam Hazeh, and that's being the basis for us to be able to plug in the halacha. Very fascinating. Because what was considered chashuv back in the day is not chashuv today. It reminds me of the joke. Jackie Mason has this joke. He talked about Cajun food. I don't know if people like Cajun food. I don't know if they do or not. It's burnt food. It's burnt food. He says so. Years ago they used to call it burnt food. Today they call it Cajun food. It's all suddenly becomes a whole culinary delight. But we're all kidding aside. It is true that there are different cultures and things do change with generations about what's considered, what's what. Okay, halacha vav. Yeah.
So it's decided according to the non-Jewish standard of what's respectable.
The standard of that country. Not about Jewish, not Jewish. What's considered the standard of that country? Is that the kind of food that you would serve at a king's table? Yes or no?
So like what Americans like?
Yeah, here in America, do we serve corn chips or do we serve, let's say, corn chips at a king's table? No, you don't. You wouldn't serve it at a fancy event. It would be considered to be disrespectful. You might eat it on the side as a snack, or you might eat it on the after party, but the actual event itself, you wouldn't do that. It doesn't fit the decorum of what you're trying to achieve for such an event. So now we're going to get into another discussion, by the way, which your question led me into. So we're probably going to get into it more later, but I want to just touch on it now. There's another debate in halacha, which is very fascinating. And this is a debate from, I believe it's contemporary poskim. I don't remember who says what. I know what the debate is. Do we go after the min ha-maichel? Do we go after the source of the food, the origin of the food, or do we go after the food the way it is now? I'm going to give you an example. If we're going after the source of the food, the potato, right? Potato is not edible raw, and it becomes kosher when you bake it as a potato, and therefore it has to be bishul yisrael. On the other hand, if you say you're going after the final appearance of the food, when somebody takes slices of potato, deep fries them, and makes a snack out of them, known as potato chips, which is one of the 4 basic food groups in the American diet, so it's not kosher really in that state. You wouldn't serve that at a king's table. So if you're going to go after the final appearance of the food, you can argue and say it doesn't have to be bishul yisrael. It's a snack food. It's a maichel ziburis. It's not a kosher of a maichel. On the other hand, if you say, well, wait a second, it originates from a potato. It's a potato, and it has to be bishul yisrael because the potato is not edible raw. So that's a machlekes. And therefore, in actuality, to answer the question whether or not potato chips have to be made bishul yisrael, there are different opinions about it. So what should one do? If you live in a place where you can get bishul yisrael potato chips, for sure one should be stringent because you have the ability to do what's the more stringent position and the better position But if you live in a place where Bishul Yisrael potato chips are not available, and somebody wants to be lenient, they have who to rely upon if they want to be lenient. I'll tell you a story. I'm not embarrassed to say this. Years ago, I used to eat non-Bishul Yisrael potato chips on the road when I would travel. So as soon as I get stuck somewhere, and I wouldn't bring it to my house. I wouldn't have it in my house because I have better choices where I live. But if I'm traveling far away and I was hungry and I had nothing to eat, so I would buy that because luckily it's allowed you to rely on, but it's not the best. But then it's an Indian that Erev Rosh Hashanah, it's an Indian to take on a hiddur mitzvah, take on an extra thing. So Erev Rosh Hashanah, I took on a hiddur mitzvah that I'm not going to eat non-Bishul Yisrael potato chips, even when I'm traveling. No, I'm not going to do it. I don't do it anymore. But I said to myself, I'm also doing a mitzvah in my health. I'm going to have less potato chips in my system. That was what I decided. Anyway. So, but what about corn chips? Corn chips are a different story because corn corn chips are deriving from corn. And corn is a feedstock in and of itself, is already less chashuv than a potato. So there are those that argue and say that corn chips b'chlal don't have to be Bishul Yisrael, and that it's much more lenient in halacha than potato chips. Even so, there are still some people that are makbid. The same question would be, what about tortilla chips and all these other kind of chips? By the way, corn chips, if they're made from corn flour, would be a shahakol. Just another point to mention. If they're made from grits, which they're usually not, because it's a flat substance, then it would be, if it's made from grits. There are some corn flakes that are made from grits. Those would still be haladana, but most of them are not made that way. Okay. Any questions? What about some other foods? Like, let's talk about some other fun stuff. What about sushi? You know the joke about sushi? Two Jewish people decided they want to open a restaurant. They didn't have a kitchen, so they made sushi. But sushi is interesting because you cook the rice, and then you have the fish going inside. So let's say the fish is raw; it's not being fried. So is that a proof that fish is edible raw? And I believe it's called surimi. That's mamish just fish raw. I don't know. So sushimi, yeah, all these things that they get me very, very worried. I don't go near those things. I do eat sushi, but I try to have only vegetable sushi. But the consensus amongst halachic authorities and kashrus professionals is that fish still has to be made bishul yisrael because most people don't eat fish raw, and even those that do, they're eating it when it goes through a certain amount of professional prep. They're not taking a fish, straight out of the water and just filleting it and having a dinner. It's not how it works. So it goes through what's known as tipul. It goes through like a professional form of preparation. So it still needs to be made bishul yisrael. And when it comes to sushi, the cooking of the rice is very critical because the rice cookers don't have a burning pilot. So mashgiach or mashgicha has to be very vigilant to make sure that they turn on the rice cooker, and when they're not around, it's often advisable and recommended is for them to use what's known as a plug lock. They'll lock the plug, so you're making the sushi rice cooker inoperable without the mashgiach or mashgicha's presence. Canned tuna. Well, anyways, you need a mashgiach tamidi to make sure that it's tuna, and so therefore the mashgiach would turn on the fire. It'll be bishul yisrael.
For example,
it's always made b'shul yisrael by every hashkacha, but there are some hashkachas that don't require mashgiach tamidi by tuna fish. That's a leniency that it has a leniency about that, but many achshem don't accept that leniency. They're okay, stringent. They don't allow that. So if you see a tuna fish that says b'shul yisrael, it doesn't automatically mean it's mashgiach tamidi. Be very careful about that. If it says mashgiach tamidi, then automatically means it's b'shul yisrael as well.
what's mashgiach?
Mashgiach tamidi means there's a constant Jewish supervisor there, mashgiach or mashgicha, watching the process, making sure, seeing the fish come in, taking the skin off, etc.
says OU, like the Kentula that like has an OU on it, that's fine.
They're not makbid. OU is not makbid on having a mashgiach tamidi for year-round certified tuna, and that's a problem for us. We don't agree with that position. They have articles that explain their position, I believe, on their website, but it's not a mainstream accepted position by a lot of hashgachas. Some hashgachas rely on it, but it's not. And also fish is the raisa, so it's a pretty serious matter. For Pesach, I'm told that the OU has a mashgiach tamidi because of Pesach. But in principle, they don't require it year-round.
Wow.
There's different standards, there's different policies, and they'll tell us to. Whatever I'm sharing with you is public information.
But how can we know all these nuances? Because I feel like there's always nuances within a sure.
This is why we have shiurim and we have education and we have an opportunity to ask questions. Information should be out there. It's important. But most of the differences in standards are a lot of them are relating to fish. Actually, some of the other stuff is more obvious, but yeah. Okay. We're going to get into the halachas of taruvis. If something is mixed, just like we said by pasakum, that if something gets mixed into the food, it's nullified in the majority. If you mix in food that's edible raw, in a food that needs to be cooked, you go after the majority of the food. Okay. If the majority of the food is from the type of food that's edible raw, and the non-Jew cooks it, because it's mostly edible raw and it's all mixed together. It's not discernible. Everything is mixed together. Let's say it's all pureed and you can't see one from the other. There's another leniency, even if they're both equal, you're also allowed to eat it. Even if the food became after cooking it, got mixed into permissible food, it's bottle b'rayv. Now, this that we say it's bottle, as long as the Michael that's asr, because the principle of bit, the word of bittul, they stipulate that something is only bottle if it's not discernible. You can't say something is bottle when it's discernible. If you have a piece of, let's say, potato floating on a soup on top, you can't say it's bottle, it's right there, you see it. On the other end, it's all zoomed together, it's all pureed, and you can't discern any from the other, then you can say you're going after the majority. Okay. Now I want to share some other insights about the industry with you. When it comes to certification of lox, which is really, it's salmon that's cured. So there are three basic ways to make lox. You can cold smoke it and prepare it that way, become ready. You can hot smoke it, or you can actually have it cooked in an oven using liquid smoke. Cold smoking it is just a cold process. Doesn't even get into the discussion of Bishul Akum because it becomes ready to eat in a cold process. Therefore, there's no question of Bishul Akum there. Not a problem. Hot smoking through wood chips, just with wood chips itself, smoking itself. We're going to learn later that the Chachamim, when they made the prohibition of Bishul Akum, they did not prohibit smoking, a non-conventional type of cooking process. They only prohibited a conventional type of cooking process. So, for example, Rav Moshe finds it right if someone cooks something on a radiator, non-conventional, it wouldn't be Bishul Akum. Okay, now, what was I saying? I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Right, back to the lox. Okay, so hot smoking would be if you have wood chips in a room, that are cooked, fired, and then it causes embers of smoke, and that cures the fish. That would not require Bishul Yisrael either because it's smoking isha. But then the last way of doing things is where it's actually getting cooked in an oven, which is a classical form of cooking, which in halacha requires Bishul Yisrael, and they develop a flavor. They get it from a flavor house known as liquid smoke. It's a liquid flavor that has the same aroma and mouthfeel, whatever it is, of smoke. So it mimics the same experience that you would have from the wood smoke, right? But here it's actually being cooked in an oven, and then they're just finding a way of spraying the smoke, this liquid smoke, into the fish as it cooks through a nozzle and all that. That requires Bishul Yisrael, l'chol hadeyis, according to all opinions, needs Bishul Yisrael. So depending on how something is processed, right, a kashrus professional will do such an evaluation to determine, you'll determine whether or not you have to have a Bishul Yisrael program in place. But in the latter example, you have to have it in place. Now, with that itself, some hechsherim allow a system which is known as the telephone dial-up system. A lot of these ovens, the highly sophisticated ovens, are all run by computers. You don't actually have a person going in and doing things. So if it's run by a computer, and you can actually program the oven in such a way where it can only be operated through punching in a certain code and opening up the, I guess, the motherboard or whatever it is, and then you can type in another code and you can actually activate the oven from a distance. So you could be 100 miles away and you can watch on a computer or watch on a camera rather, and you're actually turning on the oven. And so whether or not that would qualify as Bishul Yisrael, right? If a Jew does that, so the national Hashadim, to the best of my knowledge, they all accept such a method, in conjunction with the fact that it's being manufactured in a factory setting. So in a factory setting, we have another leniency, the fact that the end user is not going to have any relationship with the manufacturer. John Doe, who's going to be making the fish or preparing the fish in the factory, is not going to come to meet a person who's eating the fish some other state later, a different place. There's such a great distance, a great disparity between them. So it's an accepted system of making Bishul Yisrael, albeit it's not the most muhadar system, because it's more muhadar when the person's actually there itself. But halachically, it still can qualify if someone does it set up right. Just mentioning to giving an example where you're using technology to help regarding halacha, and it could actually qualify. Okay. Now, the next subject, which is within the same subject, but halacha zayin gets into domestic help in the home. I'm going to touch on it more, I think, outside, because I don't think we have enough time to get inside. But it's important to have certain parameters when it comes to domestic help at home. So you set certain boundaries, and one of the boundaries we have to set, which is a very firm boundary, is that there's no cooking done by anyone outside the actual household itself. So the domestic help can help clean in the kitchen, can help do prep work, but actual cooking, turning on fires, has to be done by someone who's Shomer Shabbos. Now, what about turning on the hot water urn or the kettle for Shabbos, plugging in the kettle for Shabbos? It's just water. Water is edible raw, right? From the strict letter of the law, it wouldn't be a problem if the housekeeper plugged in the hot water urn, because the water is anyways edible raw. But from a perspective of whether is it a good practice to do that, because then there's a heightened possibility that the housekeeper will say, "Oh, they let me plug in the water, so they're also going to let me fry an egg." So as from a good practice perspective, which is known as the fifth of Shulchan Aruch, which means like some common sense perspective, it's not really a good idea to allow that either. You should have a blanket policy, because the non-Jewish housekeeper, she's not studying the Torah, she's not expected to know these laws. So you have a policy, all fires are turned on by someone from the family. It's not one of your responsibilities. It's not something we can have you do. So then when you have that, you're keeping an even standard. The same would be in a catering setting. So when you have food that's already been cooked and it just has to be warmed up, and you have these chafing dishes with the lighting gel, you're warming up food that's already been cooked. It's already made Bishul Yisrael. If a non-Jew would light all the lighting gel, it wouldn't make it Bishul Akum. It's not a problem. But nonetheless, because of chinuch, to keep a uniform standard, it's advisable that all the fires should be lit by a yid as well. Okay, make sense? So, and in order to do this appropriately, it's also very important that those that have a housekeeper at home should be, first of all, it's a mental thing to do anyways. Make sure you feed them lunch. Give them lunch and arrange for someone to make them lunch. Make sure that they're, first of all, like I said before, it's mental. They're working with you. You're not allowed to not let them eat. It could be cruel. And second of all, mitzvah kashrut is very important. So this way, they're not going to bring in their own food, and also this way, they're not going to be tempted to start cooking food. So set it up in a very, very systemic way where you're taking care of the needs of the housekeeper within the bounds of halacha, and then you have a smooth sailing with it. There was nothing by halacha on.